How did the Wehrmacht integrate lessons learned and evolving technology to create superior doctrine? We look at the competition for superior doctrine.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 108 of the Principles of War podcast. The competition for superior doctrine. This is the third episode in our series of interviews with Dr Robert Lyman, the author of Victory to Defeat, the British Army, 1918 to 1940, a book that he co-wrote with Lord Dannatt, a previous Chief of the General Staff of the British Army. This episode looks at how Wehrmacht doctrine was developed, how the British Army's logistics capability was developed, and what can be done to improve the interface between military high command and the government to improve grand strategy. Let's return to our interview now. The British Army suffered not only from the loss of the tactical lessons from the First World War, but also the failure to adapt to the technological advances, to things like communications in tanks. How was the German army able to extrapolate out what technology was going to be able to do on the battlefield so much better?
The technology the Germans used was very pragmatic, and I would suggest that they learnt lots of lessons in 1940-41, because many of the tanks that were deployed in 1940 were lightweight vehicles with machine guns only. I mean, the Panzer Mark III, the first major maneuver tank of the German army, was ubiquitous in 1941, along with the Mark IV. Indeed, by the end of the war, the Mark IV was still the German tank in most numbers, the tank that the Germans had in most numbers. Quite a remarkable vehicle. They focused on using their tanks in particular to achieve operational effect. By that I mean, what are you going to do with your maneuver formations to defeat the enemy? Well, a couple of things. The first thing is you want to be able to bypass, you want to be able to surprise, you want to be able to avoid positions, not always, but sometimes you want to avoid positions of defense because you want to bypass them and allow them to wither on the vine. That means you need mobility, you need cross-country mobility, so you need good tracks. You don't want too much heavy armor because that slows you down, but you also need to have a psychological effect, so that's a psychological effect, but you also need to have the ability to defeat enemy armor, so you need a good gun. Now, the big challenge the Germans had during the war is they wanted mobility because their whole concept of blitzkrieg was based on maneuver, so they needed lighter tanks with big guns. It's very, very hard. The trade-off in armor is between mobility, armor, and firepower. As the war became more defensive from 1943 onwards, it's very interesting to see the change in German armor design going to much more towards defense, and these very, very heavy behemoths, leviathans even, tanks turned up that could move very slowly but were very heavily armored with very big guns. The truth is that I think the Sherman, and by 1944, really exemplified the best in this form of design. You needed tanks that were well armored, could continue to maneuver effectively, but had a good gun, particularly the Shermans with the 77mm Fireflies. And the best German tanks did that as well. So this is the point. There's a lot of, I think I would say that at the start of the war, the Germans knew that they wanted a war of movement / maneuver where they were going to bypass enemy positions. They wanted shock effect, so mass tanks together. Just the sound of even light tanks traveling through French towns caused whole French regiments to up and leave, because the psychological discombobulation caused by sound and the effect of the feeling of the enemy behind you was very, very substantially destabilizing. And it's only later that they really worked to increase things like their radio communications. Radio communications in the early days weren't particularly good. They still relied very heavily on flags between tanks, so companies and troops and companies operated by flags, and also runners on motorbikes. So the ubiquity of the German motorbike was effectively a liaison tool. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that the real breakthrough with the Germans in 1940 was coordinating with air power, with Stukas. Stukas were the primary means of providing forward artillery to the operational maneuver groups. And they were dramatically successful, of course. And it's very interesting when you look at 1944, British tactics were almost exactly the same as the 1940 Blitzkrieg doctrine, where on a German position in Northwest Europe, or indeed on a Japanese position in Burma in 1945, fighter ground aircraft would go in and stomp the position well in advance. It would then be blatted by indirect fire, and it would then be either bypassed by tanks or attacked by tanks and infantry. Those are exactly the same tactics that the Germans were using in 1940, albeit 1944, a bit more sophisticated, but the same principles, absolutely the same principles involved. So the Germans, yes, I think maybe the answer to the question is starter's advantage. They had plenty of time to rehearse. That's another very good point. The Germans practiced like Billy-O. I mean, one of the great features of the German military year was their training cycle. They would start with, in the early part of the year, the first quarter of the year, with basic skills, infantry skills, soldiery skills. They would then go into company and battalion training. And then from August onwards in the summer months, they would progressively develop through larger and larger formation training, so brigades, divisions, corps. And they trained relentlessly. What does an army do in peacetime? If it doesn't train, it's lost. And I think that's a real challenge to most societies now who look at armies and say, well, they're a utilitarian tool. We use them to put out forest fires or do X, Y, and Z. Actually, the primary duty of an army is to remain fully trained for its warfighting tasks. Train, 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 train. And I think that's another little challenge we have in the British Army today. This focus. Training is expensive. Training is a bit of an embuggeration for troops as well, because it takes them away to Germany and Canada and Kenya and so on, and it's a long way from their families and so on. But it's really, really critical to ensuring that armies remain at a sharp edge.
Moving on to logistics now, if we think about the tooth-to-tail ratio, how far did that degrade in the British Army in the interwar years?
Well, massively, I'm afraid. There wasn't really any sense that a manoeuvre formation needed to be fully integrated with combat support and combat service support. The fundamental trinity of our modern doctrine is based on them all operating together, all having the same level of protection and mobility. And there's a famous story of the last formation exercise in the British Army in Aldershot in 1931, basically a division in the field being supported by thousands and thousands of horse-drawn carts travelling over the hills around Guildford and blocking up all the roads. I think in the 1930s, with some of the field service regulations, the structural concept of logistical resupply to the army was well laid out. But unfortunately, it was laid out on the pattern of a defensive army. In all of the field service regulations, very good diagrams, actually, and some of the pamphlets that were produced presented the structure of logistical, so basically combat service support as we know it today, of support to a division and a corps and an army for ammunition, for food, for casualties and so on, fuel and so on, were all laid out on the lines that you would have expected to see them in 1916 and 1917. So it's a pattern of layered combat service support without any consideration given to the fact that actually if we're withdrawing or if we're maneuvering in the advance or the offensive, the situation would look very, very different. So again, it's a failure of imagination, and it's a failure of thinking through what might be required to happen were the balloon to go up.
So during the conduct of the Second World War, it was, I think you've already mentioned 2nd Alamein, that was Monty being able to get 8th Army to be able to generate a combined arms effect at the army level, which was effectively a 1918 advance.
It was actually a 1917 advance, yes. So 1918 saw a very different sort of advance in which the army was broken into operational packets. No, that wasn't the way that he had experienced 1917, where he had been the primary staff planner in the 47th Division, and where he had spent all his time constructing very elaborate, closely integrated artillery and infantry movement, but largely on a linear level. Now, that's not to decry his experience, but he always decried 1918, Monty. He saw it as an aberration, and he saw real success in battle being formations teeing up on a linear level. And I'm afraid that's what we saw in 1942. Now, it was needed, I think. The army had struggled through 1942 with both Wavell and then Auchinleck really struggling to get a grip of how one might maneuver to stop Rommel. And we got to a position in October and November 1942 where Montgomery said, well, bollocks to all that. We're going to stop him and we're going to defeat him in the age-old way of integrating artillery, integrating firepower, and effectively it's firepower, and destroying him and then advancing with infantry. Very interestingly enough, through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, I joined the British Army in 1981, the basis of our doctrine was called the application of force. And the primary pamphlet which we used, a very big, thick document, a lot of it which was based on case studies from the Second World War, was called the application of force. And the picture on the front cover was Montgomery. And this was a legacy of his approach to Alamein. It wasn't a defense based on maneuver, so using channeling techniques or using mobile formations to outflank Rommel and so on. We don't have time to go into the whole of the 1942 doctrinal battle. But one of the reasons why Montgomery in October and November 1942, the Second Battle of Alamein, did what he did was because there wasn't any doctrine in the British Army that said the way to fight and the maneuver way is to do X, Y, and Z. He was forced back on his own experience to 1917. And I think it really is, if you look at, I had a friend, John Latimer, who died sadly in 2009. He wrote a couple of very good books from the North African campaign, particularly on Alamein. We sat down together many years ago looking at this. And he said, look at Monty's plan. Monty's plan was classic 1917, full integration on a linear advance. And it's very different to the Fourth Army advance for instance, in 1918. Very different plans, very different ideas. In 1918, we had Rawlinson identifying the Hindenburg line and points on the Hindenburg line for attack, and the entirety of the Fourth Army was focused not on a linear advance of the Hindenburg line, but on elements moving in divisional packages and brigade packages through the German depth positions to those locations. So a very different concept of fighting. But I think we need to remember the sort of military political problems that we had in 1942. We needed a victory. And Montgomery needed a victory, personally, and the Eighth Army needed a victory. Britain needed a victory. We had Churchill observing that, of course, he wrongly, but, before 1942, he said, before Alamein, we had never had a victory. After 1942, we never had a defeat. It just shows how little Churchill knew about the Far East, but there we are. I think the reasons for Monty's particular battle strategy in 1942 need to be understood in that context.
It's interesting you talk about exercises. He was the chief umpire for Exercise Bumper, which I think was the largest exercise ever conducted. I think 2 corps on each side, plus a few independent brigades. It was interesting, the learnings that came out of that and the ability. He spent a lot of time then with his Commander Royal Artillery looking at how to give them the ability to communicate. So a lot of work that went into building up the signals capability.
This is where Monty really shines. He was a trainer excellence. So if you're thinking about Monty as a doctrinal innovator, you can forget it. He wasn't. He knew how to be successful in battle in the Monty way. And it was about teeing up infantry, artillery, air power, and armor to operate effectively still in an attritional way, but in an integrated way, in quite a sophisticated way. And he practiced and he practiced and he practiced. I mean, he was probably the trainer par excellence in 1939, 40, 41, 42. That was his leitmotif.
So much of the problems that we've had, that we've discussed today, they talk about the relationship between the military and the government. How can they work better together? Okay,
so there are some very simple answers to that. The army and the government need to trust each other. One of the challenges that we have is politicians regularly saying to the army, well, you want money, don't you? Because that's just what you want. You need money because you want flash tanks and all the rest of it. That sort of conversation denotes a lack of intelligence, a lack of trust, a lack of respect. The reality is we need to start with a grand strategic plan where the country sits down and says, we think in the worst case scenario, we are looking at a war against this particular country that has this capabilities. You then sit back and you say, okay, in order to counter that, in order to prevent it, we need to do X, Y, and Z with our force structures, and we need to do X, Y, and Z with, or A, B, and C with our equipment. So that's where the equipment plan comes from. Unfortunately, in our view, Richard and I are agreed on this. We, over the last, maybe as far back as 1989, at the end of the Cold War, formally in 1991, we have lost sight of the need to have a very, very close relationship between the political and military in terms of our grand strategy. And we have a reversion to a pre-war notion that the army is simply a utilitarian force available to the country to go and stomp out forest fires wherever they might occur, without realizing that actually the Army, Navy, and Air Force themselves need to be fully integrated within the grand strategic plan. And I think as soon as you lose sight of that, you've got problems. And one of the real challenges the Army has is throughout the 2000s, the Army was saying, okay, we're being forced to operate in Afghanistan and Iraq simultaneously. We have a grand strategic plan as a country to have a high intensity capability to be able to oppose another problem. Just because Russia's gone into a state of, a comatose state for a while doesn't mean that threat has necessarily gone. But we have politicians who don't believe that, who don't see it, who don't believe in the grand strategic plan, and who are quite happy to take risks with our existing capabilities, and they get rid of it. And then we have a very strange affair where we have soldiers, intelligent people in the 2010 saying, well, actually, perhaps we aren't going to fight a high-intensity campaign again. Maybe what we need to go back is just think about counterinsurgency. That's going to be one of the key features of the future, which is proved to be completely ephemeral and completely wrong. And so you have all of a sudden you have arguments. You have divisions within the army. You have the Treasury saying, well, the army doesn't know what it wants. There was a perennial problem in the 1930s. It's a phrase that I've heard repeatedly in the last few years. The army still doesn't know what it wants. In fact, outrageously, the Navy and the Air Force use that as something to knock the army. You still don't know what you want, because the challenges are legion. And we need to go back to first principles every time and say, what the army needs is what the state determines in our grand strategy. And if we go back to that, then, and we're honest with it, we'll be able to have a logical strategic plan as a country, and we will fund it properly. If you don't believe in the grand strategy, you won't fund it properly. Now, throughout all of this, you're always going to have challenges from the Treasury saying, we can't afford this, we can't afford that. And, you start losing capability. We had David Cameron removing the Harrier Strike Force from the RAF in the early 2000s, and for about a decade, the army suddenly losing its fighter ground attack capability, which he had never considered. These absurd decisions, which he took on grounds of cost and because he thought that actually in due course we're going to get F-35s, which are not used as ground attack aircraft, meant that a very significant part of combat utility, not just army, we're not just talking about the army, we're talking about combat utility, was removed. So that's a real problem. But look, it's a problem that all democratic societies are going to have with politicians who don't necessarily put I'm not saying this pejoratively, they don't necessarily put the grand strategic plan at the forefront of their political ambitions. They put themselves to the forefront of their political ambitions. We have a watering down as a consequence of what's important for the country.
I think one of the interesting challenges is within the army, you really start thinking about grand strategy as you do staff college.
Yeah.
After that, it's predominantly strategy, grand strategy, and how all of that's going to articulate at the operational and sometimes the tactical level. There is no staff college for politicians, though.
No, there isn't. But I would say that most politicians that I've known over 35 and 40 years of doing this have, and I was in the Ministry of Defence for a while as well, working at a pretty serious level in the Office of the Chief of the General Staff. And so I could see the way in which politicians worked, where politicians accept the role of the armed forces at that level as providing advice and providing their strategic advice and accepting it and working with it, you can have a particularly profitable relationship. I think in Britain, if any of your listeners are aware of this, I think for us personally, it came apart when Gordon Brown was our Chancellor and he began messing with the Strategic Defence Review and refusing to fund it, that we really had a first breakdown in my experience between politicians and servicemen trying to work together to execute a grand strategic plan. And I think that's a real challenge we have with politicians generally. Otherwise, intelligent, sparky, bright individuals, if this isn't part of their DNA, then they're never going to get it. There's a very, very famous confrontation between General Lord Guthrie, who was Chief of the Defence Staff at the time, and Gordon Brown on this particular subject. And the relationship wasn't good and the conversation wasn't going particularly well on this occasion. Brown said to Guthrie, "I know quite a lot about defence, And Guthrie responded by, and forgive the language, "I'm afraid, Chancellor, you know fuck all about defence." I mean, it's evident in what you're describing. That's the problem. It's about being honest with each other, relying on each other, working together. And where you get individuals who, frankly, don't do that, you're going to fail. It doesn't matter how many systems and structures you have. It does depend on the personal relationships, ultimately.
Looking at everything that you've looked at in the book, what do you think the lessons are for today? How do we do better?
It's a challenge, and I'm a little bit of a pessimist now after having written the book, because the problem is, as I keep on saying, the further we go away from real war, our experience of it, the less likely are we to get it right. War becomes a theory. Armies become utilitarian instruments of the state, not forces in being to defend the state when the balloon goes up. And I can't see anyone in the British government, certainly, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there's no core of reservoir of political expertise in the British government that actually understands the armed forces. It's just a reality of where we are. I mean, politicians, until, right into the time I joined the army and perhaps into the late 1980s, many of them had seen service in the Second World War. Many of them were deeply influenced everyone had been deeply influenced by the Cold War, and we thought in a particular way. That brand of politician has now gone. And it's an important feature of the way in which the army needs to operate, to keep on banging the drum and being honest and with our political masters and using formal and informal routes to get our message across, so that politicians don't just see the army as trying to defend an institution, but they're trying to deliver something that's good for the country and trying to deliver effectively the insurance policy that the country deserves, even though it doesn't particularly understand why it needs it. And we have day-to-day issues with trying to persuade people that defense is an important function of statehood. And we aren't going to exist in a period of relative peace as we have done in this country for a long period of time. I say relative, I think, until the end of the operations in Afghanistan in 2014, Britain had the only year that Britain had not lost troops in battle or in combat or conflict was 1968, I think. So, since the end of the Second World War. So it's relative peace. But if we aren't going to live in relative peace forever. And what we need to be thinking about is what happens when that relative peace ends and the balloon goes up and we are called upon to do something quite dramatic. I think February 2022 was the wake-up call for us. Richard and I were busy away on our book. We woke up in the morning to discover that Russia had ineptly launched an invasion of Ukraine, and we both looked at each other and said, well, this is why we're writing this book. It's a wake-up call. It's a cautionary tale. Let's not waste the 20 years of the 1920s and 30s by repeating those mistakes, by not preparing ourselves for the future. If I have any degree of optimism, it's that the British Army in particular, and the armed forces as a whole, has a very good handle on its operational and warfighting doctrine. It understands the need for it. My concern really is the rapid whittling down of military capability across the UK armed forces as a whole. There is this quite devastating focus on new technology, where the new technology is much, much more expensive than the old, and we can buy, therefore, much less of it. If you buy a lot less of the new technology because it's expensive, then it becomes less useful in a military sense. So, the number of aircraft that we've got to support ground units operating in combat is a fraction of what it used to be. The question then is, do we have an integrated capability? I think the answer very simply is no, we don't. And we certainly can't sustain it. So we have moved beyond the tipping point, in my view, in Britain. We don't have the capability to deploy a division in battle and to sustain it thereafter. We might be able to deploy an armoured brigade and sustain that for maybe 3 rule months, and that's about it, which is quite extraordinary. But the integrated capabilities, fires capabilities, so warfighting capabilities, don't exist either. That's a problem for the country. It's not just a problem for the army. And it needs a conversation. It needs a constant conversation. And anyone who might suggest that we're living in a more peaceful world in which the requirement for the army not to be at the top of its game is just they're living in cloud cuckoo land. They don't understand the world that I'm watching, which is a world that's violently fractured. It will become more violently fractured, in which competing national and international claims are going to conflict with each other, and friends one day may not be friends the next. And we are way behind the curve in terms of understanding how to deal with it. And my final point, I think, is just to say this is not just about fighting capability. This is about sustainment capability. Think about the fact that in Britain, well, I won't tell you, but our ability to build ammunition is so dramatically degraded that we can't provide enough for our own training purposes, let alone give stuff to Ukraine. So if you're going to sustain operations into the future, let's build up some stocks of ammunition, because that's the first thing we're going to use.
Indeed. So I like to think that I'm a very optimistic person. I think you've missed one of the key things that people could do to prepare, and that would be to read your and Richard's book. Because I think that there's a huge number of lessons in there, and we've spoken for you've been very generous with your time. We've covered some of the ground. There's a lot in the book that really sort of does highlight what the problems are, and I think some of the answers. So thank you very much for your time today. I'll leave a link in the show notes to the book, because it's one of the best books I've read in the last few years. It's the insights are profound. It does paint a moderately pessimistic picture, but I think recognizing that there's a problem, that's the first step.
Exactly right. Thank you very much. I mean, I've enjoyed it, and I always enjoy talking about the book, although it is depressing. I think we have agency, of course. We have political agency, and we've got the ability in Australia and elsewhere to make positive decisions with regard to the future of our country, the security of our countries. And I think you're right that if everyone were to read our book, then I'd be very happy. But I think if we were simply just to raise the subject in an intelligent and non-partisan way, by non-partisan, I mean, I don't exist simply to argue that the army needs to have more tanks and aircraft and Apache helicopters and so on, because that will be a good thing. There is a real purpose behind it. There's very little partisanship in what we're presenting, although we have been accused of being quite polemical. I'm happy to take all those accusations if we're doing the right thing.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Rob's been very generous with his time across the 3 episodes of our interview. And for me, there's 2 dominant narratives that stretch across each of the episodes. The first one is the challenge around doctrine development. How is doctrine developed? How is doctrine developed as technology evolves? And how is doctrine developed when you're planning to fight a foe who is also developing their doctrine? How do you stimulate that doctrinal imagination? And how do doctrine developers narrow the gap between the doctrine that you have at the start of a war and the doctrine that you have at the end of the war? Because the longer the process takes, the more expensive the war is to fight. One organisation that I think did a really good job of developing doctrine in the interwar period, really having a strong doctrinal imagination, was the US Navy. And I plan on doing a couple of podcasts about it. The 2 things that they had in their favour were their fleet problems and wargaming. Wargaming was built into officer education, and it enabled them to experiment with tactics and also to understand what it was like to be defeated. The Fleet Problem series were very large exercises held by the Navy. Fleet Problem 1 was held in 1923, and it had 165 ships and 40,000 men. Critically, it used 2 battleships to represent aircraft carriers. So in 1923, the US Navy was experimenting with what effect an aircraft carrier could have. Two battleships represented the still under construction USS Langley. So they were the USS New York and the USS Oklahoma. And the Oklahoma launched one aircraft that represented a squadron of 15 planes. It dropped some 10 miniature bombs and theoretically destroyed a part of the Panama Canal. It's a fascinating story of doctrinal imagination, experimentation, and development. The second theme is, how does a military work better with the government to ensure that grand strategy is effective at the time when it is most needed, and that is when a nation comes under attack. The dilemma faced by the vast majority of nations who aren't aggressors is that they don't get to pick the time, nor the place, nor the manner in which they are attacked. How is a military prepared in time to enable them to adequately defend the nation, or indeed act as a deterrent? Robert's spoken very eloquently about the issues that were faced within Britain and the British Army. But the echoes of those mistakes reverberated very loudly for Australia. And the current series, where we're looking at the 53rd Battalion, sees the battalion set up to fail because of mistakes that were made at the operational and strategic level. The next episode will look at the problems at the operational level and how that impacted on the ability to defend Kokoda and the entire Kokoda track. And once we're done with that, we're then going to look at how the strategy let the 53rd Battalion down, and indeed all of the troops who had been deployed to New Guinea.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.